Think about the version of you that shows up when you're with your closest friends. The one who laughs too loud, says the stupid thing without thinking twice, doesn't flinch at being weird. Now think about the version of you that shows up at a family dinner. Quieter, more careful, choosing your words like you're picking through a minefield. Now think about the version of you in a group chat with people from a class you don't know that well. More polished, more careful, watching what you say before you say it. Here's the unsettling part. None of those are you pretending. Each one feels completely real while you're inside it. So which one is actually you? And why does the question even feel scary to ask? For over 100 years, people who study the mind have been trying to answer that exact question. And the answer is stranger than you're just adapting. It might mean there's no single you sitting underneath all those versions at all. Back in 1890, a psychologist named William James wrote something that sounds almost too simple to be important. He said a person has as many different social selves as there are people who recognize them. Not different moods, not different outfits, different selves. At the time, this was treated as a strange philosophical footnote. Nobody had the tools to actually test it. But over the last few decades, researchers studying adolescent identity have found something that makes James's throwaway line look less like poetry and more like a literal description of what's happening inside your head. And it starts with a problem nobody warns you about. The version of you that exists is being built by every single room you walk into, whether you want it to be or not. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. If you were only pretending around some people and being real around others, that would actually be simple. You'd know which one is fake. But that's not what the research shows. A developmental psychologist named Harter spent years studying how teenagers describe themselves across different relationships, with parents, with close friends, with classmates, with romantic interests. And she found that the differences aren't small. Teenagers don't just adjust their tone. They report genuinely different personality traits, different emotional baselines, sometimes even different values, depending on who they're with. And the wildest part of her findings wasn't that this happens. It's that most teenagers, when they notice it, feel disturbed by it. Not confident, not proud of being adaptable, confused, like they've caught themselves doing something wrong, even though they can't quite explain what the crime is. Some of the teenagers in Harter studies described the gap between their different selves as so large, it felt like having a secret, even when nothing was actually being hidden. Because here's the thing your brain is quietly panicking about underneath all of this. If you can't find one consistent version of yourself across every room, what does that mean about whether you're a real, whole person at all? That question doesn't go away once you notice it. It gets worse the more you look for an answer. Because the deeper researchers dig, the more it turns out this isn't a flaw in your personality. It might be how personality is built in the first place. In the late 1950s, a sociologist named Erving Goffman proposed something that at the time felt almost insulting to how people like to think about themselves. He said that social life works like a stage, not metaphorically, structurally. Every interaction has a front stage where you're performing a version of yourself calibrated to whoever's watching, and a backstage where you drop the performance when no one's around to see it. The unsettling implication wasn't that people are fake, it's that there might not be a real self hiding backstage waiting to be discovered. The performances might be all there is. That idea sat around for decades as an interesting theory, but it wasn't until psychologists started specifically studying teenagers that it stopped being abstract and started explaining something very specific and very personal. Why the friend group version of you and the family version of you can both feel 100% genuine at the exact same time, with no contradiction and no lie anywhere in the system. Around the same time Goffman was building his stage theory, a psychologist named Snyder was noticing something else, that people differ wildly in how much they naturally shift themselves depending on their surroundings. He called it self-monitoring. Some people barely adjust at all, staying almost identical no matter who's in the room. Other people adjust constantly, reading the social temperature and recalibrating without even realizing they're doing it. Neither one is more authentic than the other. They're just different strategies for surviving being a social animal. And here's the detail that changes everything about the friend group question. Adolescence is exactly the developmental window where this self-monitoring machinery is being built and stress tested for the first time. Not because teenagers are more fake than adults, because teenagers are doing the actual construction work of figuring out which cell fits which room in real time, with no blueprint, while it feels like the highest stakes decision in the world. But there's a deeper layer underneath all of this, one that doesn't come from psychology questionnaires at all. It comes from brain scans. Researchers studying adolescent brain development have found that the parts of the brain responsible for thinking about how you're perceived by others, the medial prefrontal cortex specifically, are dramatically more active during the teenage years than at almost any other point in life. Not slightly more active, measurably, significantly more active, activating in situations where an adult brain barely registers anything at all, which means the sensation of feeling like a completely different person depending on who's in the room isn't just a psychological pattern you're imagining.
It's your brain, at this exact stage of your life, running an unusually intense, constant background process dedicated entirely to modeling how you exist inside other people's heads. You're not overreacting to the feeling of being watched and shaped by different audiences. Biologically, you're wired to notice it more than you ever will again. This is where the psychologist Erik Erikson's work becomes impossible to ignore. Decades before any of this social selves research existed, Erikson mapped out adolescence as a specific developmental stage he called identity versus role confusion, the period where your entire job, biologically and psychologically, is to try on different versions of yourself and see which ones hold up under pressure. Not because something is wrong with you, because that's literally the task your brain assigned itself for this exact stretch of your life. The friend group version of you isn't a mask hiding your real self, it's a working draft. So is the family version. So is the group chat version. You're not lying in any of them.
You're testing, but testing feels terrifying when nobody tells you that's what's happening, because from the inside, it doesn't feel like an experiment. It feels like evidence that you don't actually know who you are. Here's where the mystery gets even stranger, though, because if this is just normal identity development, why does switching between selves sometimes feel exhausting instead of easy? Researchers have found an answer to that too, and it has a name: self-concept clarity. It turns out some people move between their different social selves smoothly, without much internal friction, while others feel a kind of drag every time they switch, like changing gears in a car that hasn't been driven in a while. The people who experience that drag most intensely tend to be going through the biggest identity construction projects of their lives, which statistically describes almost every teenager on Earth. The exhaustion isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign of how much active work is happening underneath the surface every single time you walk from one room into another. There's a smaller, stranger version of this same pattern that linguists have been documenting for decades, completely separately from any of this psychology research, and it makes the whole picture even more convincing. It's called code switching. Originally, the term described people fluidly shifting between two different languages or dialects, depending on who they're talking to, not because they're confused about which language is theirs, but because different contexts genuinely call for different tools. Someone might speak one way with their grandparents and a completely different way with their friends, switching mid-conversation without even noticing the transition happened. Linguists eventually noticed that the same switching shows up even within a single language, in tone, vocabulary, and even posture, proof that this isn't some special glitch unique to identity psychology. It's a general feature of how communication works between humans, showing up in language studies, sociology studies, and adolescent psychology studies independently, as if three completely different fields of research all stumbled onto the same underlying truth from three different directions without ever comparing notes. So if none of these versions is fake, and none of them is the one true you, here's the bigger, stranger idea that all of this research eventually lands on. Maybe the entire premise of the question is wrong. Maybe which version is the real me was never a fair question to ask in the first place, because it assumes a single fixed self exists somewhere.
Underneath all the versions, waiting to be uncovered like a fossil. What if there isn't one? What if a self isn't a hidden object you find? It's a pattern that only exists in the relationship between you and whoever's standing across from you. That's not a comforting idea at first. It sounds like it means you're nobody all the time, everywhere. But flip it around, and it means something closer to the opposite. You're not one narrow person forced to squeeze into every room. You're a whole range of real possibilities, and different people call different parts of that range into existence. Your loud, chaotic friend group self isn't fake just because it disappears at the dinner table. It's real precisely because that specific mix of people creates the conditions for it to exist. Change the room, and a different real version steps forward. Not a performance covering up the truth, but a different true answer to a question that was always going to have more than one right answer. This is where it connects to something much bigger than friend groups. Every social species that lives in groups, not just humans, shows some version of this shifting behavior, adjusting based on who's around. Dominant versus subordinate members, mates versus rivals, in-group versus out-group. Evolution didn't build a single fixed self into any social animal, because a single fixed self would be a liability. An animal that behaves identically toward a predator and toward its own offspring doesn't survive long enough to pass that trait on. Flexibility was the advantage, not the exception. Being able to be several different, situationally correct versions of yourself is not a bug in how humans turned out. It's one of the reasons humans survived long enough to build friend groups, families, and group chats in the first place. Every one of those structures depends on people being able to shift, calibrate, and respond differently depending on who they're responsible to in that moment. So the next time you catch yourself being a slightly different person around different people, quieter here, louder there, softer with one group, sharper with another, that unsettling feeling isn't a sign that something's broken. It's not proof you're fake in one room and real in another. It's your identity doing exactly what identity has always done, not hiding a single true self, but building several true ones, each called into existence by the people who are there to witness it. The question was never really, which version is the real you? The real question, the one you're actually asking every time you notice the shift, is which of these versions you want to keep choosing, on purpose, now that you know you're the one choosing at all.